there's one thing that a video that you made about a Trump or the administration basically removing funding from Planned Parenthood.
Oh yeah,
is that still going through?
I believe so, more or less. But the thing is, it's just the federal level funding. As a pro-choice individual, some of your fans won't like this when I say this. I know more than half of my fans probably don't like it. I'm pro-choice. As far as federal funding, though, it's okay if that gets rescinded. The states and private groups will step in. I don't want people who are hyper-religious to have to pay for abortion because they think that it's wrong. Mm-hmm. They have an honest, deep-seated belief that it's morally wrong. I wouldn't make them pay for it. I would rather pay on their behalf. Go ahead and charge me an extra $10 at the end of the year or whatever for however many religious people don't want to pay. I don't have a problem with that.
And Jay, you being pro-life, right? What's your opinion on his opinion? I actually agree with that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that he would see the logic of at least there not being federal funding. I think that, ultimately this does come down to questions of morals and paradigms. So I would disagree with the states funding it as well. I mean, this is kind of the libertarian way to get around this, is make it a states issue. Ron Paul has this kind of position. So I understand the logic of it, but ultimately I think it comes down to a question of whether it's right or wrong and not just a question of funding. And for me, even aside from like theological or religious moral issues, is the issue of the origins of the Planned Parenthood type movement in the U.S. and where it comes from and why it's actually funded. And if you look into that, I think there's also a case to be made against it.
I think you'd find that a great proportion of my fans, your fans, and everyone watching here would actually support them more if they knew where Planned Parenthood came from. Just gonna put that out there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about like basic eugenics,
eugenics, exactly.
Right. But the problem is that kind of stuff doesn't stop with one people group. It actually ends up being turned on the other group. And I think so. That's the problem where we are now, is that the same tactics that were used on different communities have actually turned against whites now, and whites are suffering.
The only thing that I would say is fundamentally this. Whether you believe that abortion is right or wrong, government is always wrong and should not be playing a role in medical decisions. And according to my opinion, government shouldn't. If a community wants to say, we don't like abortion, we're going to discourage it, we're going to tell this woman, hey, please don't have an abortion, that's fine. Go ahead and do the moral neighborhood thing. But the government should not be making that decision. It opens up a can of worms where the government might tell you can't have some other topical medical procedure because they find it morally wrong. I don't want that to happen. I don't trust government because I look at government and I see constantly it's making the wrong decisions. It's constantly doing the wrong thing. It's constantly killing people. I want them to have less guns and us to have more. At this point, I want them to have less leeway, less money, and everyone else to have more, because I think that a private citizen, some random gang member could probably govern their money better than the government could. You give $100 to a gangbanger, they'll probably be better off with it than the government would be. That's the problem.
One thing I would say, though, is that I don't think that abortion, for example, exists in a vacuum. In other words, it's connected to a whole lot of other social engineering programs that you can actually verify. For example, there's the 1969 Jaffe-Berelson memo. If you look up the Bernard Berelson memo, you'll see this list of things where the state, at the behest of the Rockefeller Foundation, actually talked about large-scale social engineering, not just abortion, but also statism through limiting families, statism in terms of increased taxing, all there as part of the LGBTQ trans agenda in the 60s in this Planned Parenthood Rockefeller memo spelled out for our era.
You mean LGBTQAST and 10 or 20 more letters thereafter?
Make up new characters based on...
It has gone a little bit beyond. But I'll say this, they can try to socially engineer, but there will always be benevolent individuals who can stop them. So I'm not particularly worried, because counter-propaganda is way more powerful. Memetics is way more powerful than Margaret Sanger and all these people ever could possibly have dreamed of.
AJ, you're pro-life. How about if the woman is raped and then she's pregnant?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are situations where if it becomes, I mean, I don't think that our position has to be completely against reason. I think that we can utilize reason in concord with, even my religious beliefs or other people's religious beliefs. So if it's a situation where obviously the child's not going to survive, yeah, I think that's a pretty normative standard. But you get more difficult cases where what exactly happened is in dispute, rape, this kind of stuff. I think the problem is that once you open the doorway, it does become a Pandora's box. Styx makes the same kind of argument about the state, and why the state is, say, against Richard Spencer or someone like this, that we have to beware of the Pandora's box. I think that's a valid argument for things like euthanasia, the state controlling who lives and dies. I don't think the state has that should have that power.
That's actually interesting because I pointed out on the last video about it, a lot of people who are pro-life, they'll say, oh, except but for rape, incest, the mother's life is in danger maybe or something. I think you're being more honest, if I take it correctly, that you wouldn't support it in those cases either. At least that's consistency, because they'll say, oh, it's okay for mafiols or something. And it's like, well, you're saying abortion is murder, so why would it be okay just because it's an incest rape maybe or something like that? Yeah. I'm sitting here. I just say that the government should not be making that decision. I would leave it up to private citizens because I'm going to trust them more. I honestly, I can't trust government with that kind of power. I just can't do it. It's not in my nature.
Have you heard of what's happening in Ireland right now? They're having the vote to abortion is illegal in Ireland right now, right? And they're having the vote to either make it illegal or legal, right? And women from there, when they want an abortion, they fly over to the UK or take a boat there and have an abortion over there. And
that's what they did here with Canada and Mexico. Exactly, when it was illegal here.
Yeah.
But I mean, we're all aware of demographic replacement, and that the numbers are not enough for there to be replacement. And I don't think we can look past the fact that part of the reason for this is that promotion of the culture of sterilization, sterility, abortion, which has happened in the West by design.
You realize that most abortions take place in black females, right?
Right. Yeah. But that's spreading now beyond black neighborhoods. Yeah.
Well, I really don't care who gets an abortion. They're gonna get them anyway. Look, back 50, 60 years ago, before Roe v. Wade, people would just puncture their cervix with a coat hanger in the most literal sense. Now, some people think it's a coat hanger abortion. That's a lie. They would puncture their cervix to get it to bleed, and then they would go and say, hey, I'm miscarrying. And then they would have the abortion at the doctor. In the case of emergency, it was still allowed. And a lot of people ended up sterile, and a lot of people died as the result of it. I'd rather have that procedure in a medical setting than them going into an alley with a half bottle of whiskey and a rusty coat hanger. I have to say, look, if I had a daughter, I wouldn't want her to live in a country that would tell her, hey, the government's going to make this fucking decision for you. I wouldn't be comfortable with that. It should be her decision to make. I fully believe that.
Right, but I'm just making the point. I think that there's such a thing as toxic culture, that powerful groups can engineer large-scale ideologies to alter and change a culture. Like, for example, I just did a lecture on one of the top globalists of France. He's sort of the Kissinger of France, Jacques Attali. And he's such a big fan of Marxism as a capitalist, supposedly, that he can't wait for the AI to determine who lives and dies based on, these sort of private-run medical AI smart cities, right? And he says it's going to be the smart city running the tied into the medical, the big pharma, big medical corporations deciding who lives and dies. And so that's actually part of the same agenda. You have to inculcate this culture of death for many, many decades before you can get to that Jacques Attali, H.G. Wells dystopian phase.
I highly doubt that it'll be implemented because people will fight back. But that's a medical decision. That dates back decades and decades. It has nothing to do with postmodernism in the social justice warrior sense we generally understand it. We can fight back against that while still admitting the state itself should not be the one arbitering that decision.
Well, but I mean,
in my opinion.
Right, right. I mean, the Fortune 100, who are not the state but actually own many states. I mean, they promote these things globally. I mean, that's why the trans agenda is global, is because the Fortune 100 are behind it.
Well, the trans agenda can't even get past the feminists. They're constantly attacking one another. You look at a Shoe on Head and her drama; they're getting beaten up over that too. This is even touching the so-called liberalists sort of crowd. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, but Jay, do you think that abortion should be illegal here in the West?
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be the first step towards rising birth rates again. And
that would be like outlawing drugs. It won't work.
Well, actually, it has worked. I mean, there's a difference. I would say there's a difference between drugs, and I'm familiar with the complexities of like the drug war and all that. And I know the CIA runs the drugs, but I'm just saying there's a difference between that, because it's a question of morality. There's also a pragmatic aspect to the drug question. So two different issues. I wouldn't equate whether or not humans have a right to life from the womb with just the license to take drugs. Because, for example, I would say we were qualitatively a much more moral society at a time when you could go to a drugstore and buy cocaine 100 years ago. Apothecaries had cocaine.
You could also buy pennyroyal and cohosh and get a chemical abortion back then. That's right. The point.
Yeah, but just because people will do something in an unhealthy fashion doesn't mean that it's not still something that should be morally outlawed. I mean, this comes back to the question of the role of the state, which, you know, I'm not libertarian, so you and I would disagree there. But you know, I think the state does have a role in things like, for example, I'm pro death penalty. So there's a difference between life and death, and not all killing is murder.
I find it very funny that you'd be pro death penalty while at the same time being in against abortion.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I see no contradiction at all.
I'm exactly the obverse on that, and I admit the contradiction. It is very funny of me to have those views, but I will say this: the state shouldn't decide. The fundamental central principle is I don't trust the state to make that kind of decision. I don't trust it to execute someone. I don't trust it to tell people what medical procedures to get. I don't trust it to tell people what to do with their money, what to do with their land. I don't trust it to tell people what firearms they can own. I don't think that it has the constitutional right. According to my understanding of the Constitution, it shouldn't be involved in any of these things. That sort of moralism is prefaced on the temperance era. That was an afterthought. It was never really dreamed of until two things happened. 1870s, you get the Cruikshank decision, and the Southern Democrats, the Ku Klux Klan sort of Democrats, attempt gun control. Further beyond that, in the Gilded Age, you get all of a sudden the government attempting to crack down on monopolies and trusts, and this is what breeds the concept of centrality within the Americas. It was never really present. The problem is, of course, this actually didn't help, because you were also in the carpetbag era, which meant that they always could take bribes, and they would not apply those laws to the actual evildoers. They would apply it to their competitors. That's where you get corporatism. That's the government that we deal with. Why would I want to give it more power?
Well, in Ireland, there was someone who the doctor said, if she has this baby, she will die. And she had to have the baby. And she died. This is like last month.
Yeah, what a wonderful moral government, isn't it?
And no one told her, because she had no idea that if she took a boat over to the UK, that she was able to have it there. So she ended up passing away. So Jay, isn't there like a slippery slope where if you make it illegal, they'll take it to the level where if in that situation, they won't let you have an abortion, even though it's medically needed for the person to survive?
Well, okay, yeah. I mean, these kinds of cases actually are very rare, and oftentimes they're kind of rolled out as sort of like as if they happen all the time, and that's why we have to really focus on these kinds of. But they don't happen a lot. These kinds of situations. Now, I'm not saying that they don't matter, but again, there's always been, you know, the doctor has a level of making a judgment call, and that's going to be true for any kind of medical situation that's somewhat of an emergency. So I'm not being irrational in saying that there can never be situations where it's deemed advantageous to save the mother's life. Certainly. But that really is a different question from whether there's such a thing as right to life from the womb or not. Two different questions. So, in other words, because there are consequentialist ethic type dilemmas at times, it doesn't lead us to the conclusion that there aren't moral absolutes. And of course, I am somebody who supports the idea of moral absolutes.
But you say that they're rare and this is meaningful. It's also rare that people get an abortion after 5 or 6 months in the third trimester, and yet it's constantly trotted out by the pro-life crowd. Oh, look at this almost formed baby. Oh, you think that infants should be killed at 8 months, 3 weeks, and 6 days, or some crazy shit like that? That gets trotted out constantly.
No, I would totally agree with you that the majority of the pro-life crowd and their argumentation is very weak. In fact, it's almost like a humanistic type thing, and precisely because it's not grounded in any philosophy that's beyond just bare humanism, which they haven't actually justified. They actually undermine a lot of their case much of the time.
Yeah. I would also point out you can go ahead and make it illegal here and would just end up going back to what we were before Roe v. Wade. People would go to Canada or Mexico. The upper class would go to Canada, where it's, first world medicine. They can get an abortion the same as they do now. People who are a little bit less well off, or they're close to the southern border, they'll go down to Mexico. And people who are very poor, which are the most at risk anyway, will literally use, hey, I'm going to guzzle alcohol. I'm going to punch myself in the stomach. I'm going to puncture my cervix, and the doctor will think I'm miscarrying. I don't think that you want that sort of society. If you believe in the, are you a Christian? Let me ask you that.
Yeah, I'm Orthodox.
Okay, as a Christian, you can't possibly believe that that's a moral society. I'm going to hazard a guess that you can't possibly fathom a society in which a state has made that kind of decision. That sounds a lot like me, to me, like the sort of stuff that you would expect from maybe a communist authoritarian state.
Well, I mean, the history of Western civilization, especially after the rise of Christianity, put away the idea that the Romans had, that the father could actually decide whether or not the children lived or died. Or, they would oftentimes, he had the right to kill daughters. Christianity influenced that in a big way to change things. So the history of the West through the 7 ecumenical councils that we as Orthodox hold authoritative. The Byzantine Empire, I mean, the norm, and even in the West, the norm is that abortion and infanticide were considered illegal and were illegal. In fact, in Scripture, that it carries the death penalty or a similar type of penalty to if a woman has a child and you hurt the woman and it endangers the child or kills the child, you're still liable for that kind of a death type penalty. So in our theology,
propertarian sense, yeah.
In our theology, it's consistent. It's worked out. That's why we believe in just war, for example. But that doesn't mean that war is necessarily a good thing. A lot of times, life requires difficult decisions. And for example, Byzantium had to stand against Islam, and unfortunately, it fell. So that's just the realities of this world. But I don't think that my position is irrational or necessarily brings about a situation that is dystopian. In fact, it is the culture of death in all the globalists who write about this that will, in their mind, lead to this complete dystopia that they have planned.
I wouldn't say that it's an issue of globalism, because one can be more nationalistic like myself and still understand the concept that the state shouldn't have that power. I take up, though, a pragmatic line. It's not even really a libertarian line. What I'm saying is, if you were to let's say you ban abortion, except in these few cases or in all cases, people will simply skirt that law and go elsewhere. In fact, so long as there is a nationalistic world in which there are multiple states, they can always travel to another state to obtain an abortion. Somebody will be willing, because people are inherently capitalistic, to supply that good or service. Yeah, you've just created a black market within your country that's going to be exploited by people that you don't want to make money. You want to throw them in jail ultimately. And people outside of the country who are more opportunistic, they'll advertise their services. Like if abortion were made illegal in the United States, yeah, I'd probably grow more cohosh and pennyroyal. Absolutely. And, I wouldn't think that was morally wrong.
Yeah, I understand. I don't see that as a consistent line of reasoning as to why we would make something legal. For example, there's all kinds of things that people are going to do outside the law. That in itself isn't really a justification for
if it's generally unenforceable. If it is generally unenforceable to the point where people will bypass that law, I would say don't bother. This is an argument for weed legalization. It's simply unenforceable at this point. Even the states are rebelling on it. There's no way that the federal government can possibly crack down. The can of worms is open. They're not going to be able to keep up the propaganda that if you smoke weed, you're going to smoke crack. It doesn't work anymore. I carry this forward and I say it's not just weed, it's psychedelics too. That's a minority opinion now. 20, 30 years from now, we'll see if it still is. As far as abortion goes, though, this was a 70s era debate. And they had the debate because it was unenforceable. No, but it wasn't brought up because everyone agreed, hey, this is a horrible thing. We don't need abortion. Just have the child. A lot of people ended up sterilized, or they ended up dead, or they ended up going to other countries to get abortions. Millions of people. That's why they had the national debate. That's why it went before the court, because people cared.
No.
If they hadn't cared, it wouldn't have gone before the Supreme Court. There never would have been a Roe v. Wade.
I have to disagree with you there, because the reason that it became a national debate and it was passed is because of principally the Rockefeller family and their support and promotion of this, because they've had such an influence through entities like the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, which are entities that are able to, on a large scale, socially engineer. You can read about this in David Rockefeller's memoirs. He brags about it. You can read about it in Horowitz and Collier's authorized biography of the Rockefellers. They talk about this very openly. The Barrelson Jaffe memo
getting off the memo, getting off the Rockefellers, though, abortion was already happening. I can read texts from 5 centuries before that prescribe abortifacients. They were already happening. It says that's the era in which it becomes popularized. Hey, you're capable of getting this if you need it. Before that, some 14-year-old raped by her own father, probably didn't know she could get an abortion and go on with her life and not feel ashamed every day. But in that era, it becomes popularized. Now, some people, yes, they try to use it as a form of birth control. That's very regrettable. Ultimately, I like to think, and I believe that the statistics bear me out on this, that's relatively uncommon. Most people abort in the first trimester, maybe the second. They don't wait until the baby is formed. And also the Bible itself, you're Orthodox, the Bible itself speaks of the quickening. That's at roughly 5 months when the baby starts kicking and doing things. That's when the breath of life enters the infant according to the Bible, at least the King James Version.
No, again, in our view, the argument is made from Exodus chapters 19 to 22, where there's discussion.
That's the Old Testament. I believe I'm speaking of the New Testament. Let me look it up. I'll find the verse if I can.
Well, yeah, but I mean, in Orthodox theology, our theology is not just based on the New Testament. We view the whole totality of the Scripture as revelatory. But again, you're basically making a consequentialist argument for why something should be legalized, and the problem with that is that the fact that people get around things doesn't really have anything to do with whether it's right or wrong. And we're talking about issues of right and wrong, I would say, unless you just want to make a pragmatic argument, which maybe that's what you're doing.
Yeah. He keeps bringing up 1 Corinthians. That's the one about Adam, but it's similar. No, I can't remember the exact verse, but it essentially states that life begins at the quickening.
There's a Talmudic argument that life begins several months in, but for most Orthodox Christianity and the history of Christianity and the Church Fathers, that's not true. We believe
but for the United States, the Orthodox Christian path is a small minority. You do acknowledge that.
Absolutely.
Here it's mainly Protestants and then Catholics,
right,
and then non-believers.
Hey, I'm pro-choice as well. However, I do say to people who go, well, it's not a real baby yet. It's not like a real human. Like the fact that it will be a baby, that's still stopping life. Maybe not killing life, but eventually stopping what will be
from
life.
Forming. Yeah.
Yeah. So like for me, I sort of like, and I'm still pro choice, right? So that's sort of how I see it. I always think when someone's like, well, it's not technically a baby yet. I'm like, well, it will be a baby. So it feels like a cop out, almost like an excuse, like I think just call a spade, that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, and it's not something that needs to be encouraged. That's the thing. You're interjecting. Globalists would come and encourage the concept of having abortions for some wanton reason. If you want to say that that's not a good idea, that's fine. I am simply saying that something that has been done for centuries and will be done regardless of the law, it is unenforceable, and I don't trust the government to make that decision. Literally, you can have a tea of pennyroyal and blue cohosh, and it will induce an abortion. You can use a parsley pessary for these things. If it's not made more simple in the surgical sense, then it will be done in the herbal sense. That's less safe. It will have a higher death toll. That's the unfortunate part of it. It can still be done, but it will kill more people. I really don't want to prescribe death to people. I don't think that that's appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of, again, consequentialist ends justify the means, pragmatic type argumentation is the same kind of argumentation that like Alfred Kinsey would use to justify his, molesting kids and his scientific experimentation. I mean, if the ends benefit humanity in the long run, if, people are, or we could say people are going to get around the laws against molesting children. So
how does this have anything to do with molesting children or with Kinsey?
Because the basis that you made for why it shouldn't be legal, or that it should be made illegal, is because it can't be enforced and people will get around it.
It's not just the fact that it's unenforceable. It's the fact that people have been doing this for so long.
People have been molesting kids for a long time.
No, that has nothing to do with it. That's an apple and oranges comparison.
But the
violating the NAP of another sovereign individual is a little bit different from a debate over whether a lump of cells at 2 weeks in is sentient.
Well,
that's a little bit different.
They have a heartbeat. So
no, at that point it does not have a heartbeat.
Absolutely, yes, it does. It's arbitrary. It's arbitrary to say
at 2 weeks it has a heartbeat. You're saying.
It's arbitrary to say
on that one. You need to. I have to respectfully disagree and tell you to consult some biological textbooks on that one.
Well, I mean, there's quite a few
child molestation, and medical procedures are not the same thing.
No, I'm not talking about. I didn't say there's something.
The state does not have the right to tell a woman that she cannot choose an abortion, at least within a reasonable period of time. At the same time, if the state were to come out and say, hey, 10-year-olds need to go prostitute themselves, that wouldn't be appropriate either. It would violate the NAP. It's violating the NAP of a woman if it's telling her what they can or cannot do. These two things have nothing to do with one another.
This is arbitrary. There's no reason that I should follow the NAP. It's just an arbitrary thing.
Then if you don't want to follow the NAP, the government can tell you abortion's legal, deal with it, and pay it for it with your taxes, can't it?
Yeah, the government...
Pay for it, shit, Lord, essentially is what they'd say.
Yeah,
Meanwhile, I'm telling you, I wouldn't make you pay a penny. I'm willing to pay your share because I don't believe that you should be put upon any more than I should be.
Yeah. But see, it doesn't really matter whether it's the government, the state, or the corporate power, because you always talk about the state. The state is not even really a thing that has that much power in our day because it's run by corporations. The corporations, the banks own the states. So that's actually the end result of individual atomistic capitalism is the rise of the monopoly capitalists.
No, that's not capitalism. That's corporatism. That's the abandonment of capitalism in favor of centrality. Yeah, that sort of centrality is not capitalism.
It leads to that logically. Absolutely, it does, and you can trace
not in its proper form. You're thinking of carpetbagging. The corporatist model that we run today is much closer.
On what basis should anybody follow the proper form of capitalism? I mean, Ayn Rand's position, for example. I know you're not Ayn Randian, but I'm just saying.
No.
If I were to adopt Randianism, there's no reason why I should respect other people's liberties or the non-aggression principle. It's just arbitrary.
No, you shouldn't, and other people shouldn't too. That's why you need to create counterbalances of power. That's the basic form of the country relies upon the concept of the separation of powers and the fact that they balance one another.
You're assuming that separation of powers is a good, and so you have a higher metaphysical principle of the good to which you're saying that we should all strive. Maybe that's not the good. Maybe the good is just my company, my corporation smashing everybody else and taking us into the future.
That's what you should attempt to do, absolutely.
I'm the God Emperor of Dune. I'm the God Emperor of Dune.
Yes, you should. And likewise, people should resist authoritarian government if the government's trying to tell them what medical procedures they can and cannot have.